I'm not playing games. Where is she? Tell me.
You need to calm down, sir.
Don't tell me what to do. I've told you everything I know. I have had enough of your disrespect. I'm taking you in now. Sir, maybe we should calm down.
You won't find anything.
You think you can just sit here? Get up, now!
I have done nothing wrong, officer.
I told you to stop. Now I'm gonna make you. Stop!
Oh my God! No!
Officer, stand down.
Get on your feet. Now. The words cracked across the cafe like a slap, loud enough to stop every fork in midair, loud enough to make the espresso machine hissing behind the counter suddenly sound like the only honest thing left in the room. Officer Grant Holloway stood over the corner table, with his hand already closing around the strap of a worn leather satchel, and he did not wait for an answer before he yanked it off the back of the chair. The woman sitting there did not flinch. She was black, somewhere in her mid-40s, her skin a deep warm brown, her hair pulled back into a low twist that had not moved in hours. She wore a plain charcoal blazer, with no pin, no badge, no chain of office, nothing that announced anything at all. On the table in front of her sat a cooling cup of black coffee, a manila folder, and a slim silver fountain pen resting exactly parallel to the folder's edge, the way a person places an object they have placed the same way 10,000 times before. She looked up at Grant Holloway with an expression that had no fear in it, which seemed to bother him more than if she had screamed. "Sir," she said, her voice level, almost gentle, "I'm going to ask you to lower your voice before you say another word to me." Grant laughed. It was not a real laugh. It was the laugh of a man performing confidence for an audience of 11 strangers who had all stopped chewing. Nobody in the Gilded Cup Cafe on Trade Street in Charlotte, North Carolina, at 12:41 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in April, had any idea that the woman being pulled up out of her chair by Officer Westcotter's fist closing around her upper arm had been sworn into the highest law enforcement office in the United States exactly 6 days earlier. She had memorized both officers' names before either of them had finished speaking their second sentence. She had already noted the exact time on the wall clock behind the pastry case. She had already decided, somewhere in the calm center of herself, that had not moved in 20 years, that she was not going to raise her voice even once. Her name was Amara Whitfield, and she was about to become the most quietly dangerous person either of these men had ever met. 3 hours earlier, before anything had gone wrong, Amara had walked into the Gilded Cup alone, without a driver, without a single person, from her new security detail, because she had told her chief of staff exactly one sentence that morning: "I need 45 minutes, where nobody knows who I am." She had chosen this particular cafe off a list of 9, because it sat 2 blocks from the courthouse where, 23 years earlier, she had watched her father stand in a hallway, with his hands zip-tied behind his back for the crime of asking a question too many times. Her father's name had been Elias Whitfield. He had been a public defender for 31 years in Mecklenburg County, a man who wore the same 3 ties in rotation and kept a coffee-stained legal pad in his coat pocket at all times. And on an October afternoon, when Amara was 19 years old and home from law school for the weekend, she had watched 2 officers detain him outside that same courthouse because a witness statement had confused him with a defendant he was representing. It had taken 40 minutes, and a judge stepping out of chambers personally to sort it out. Her father had never once raised his voice during those 40 minutes. He had simply said, over and over, in the same even tone, "I would like you to check the file before this goes any further," and nobody had listened until someone with more authority arrived to make them listen. That night, in the kitchen of their small house on Beatty's Ford Road, her father had set his silver fountain pen down on the table, the same pen, engraved along the barrel with the initials E.W., that now sat on the table in front of Amara 23 years later, and he had told her something she had never forgotten. "Sometimes being right isn't enough in that moment," he said, "but it's never nothing. Write everything down. Remember every name. The truth doesn't disappear just because nobody's ready to hear it yet." Amara had carried that pen through 3 years of law school, through 6 years as a public defender walking the same halls her father once walked, through a decade at the Department of Justice, and 6 days before she sat down at that corner table, through a private ceremony in a wood-paneled room in Washington, where she raised her right hand and became the Attorney General of the United States. She had told almost no one where she was going that Tuesday. She wanted, for 45 minutes, to simply be a woman, with a folder of policy memos and a cup of coffee, watching a city move around her the way ordinary people watched it every single day of their lives. The people her new office existed to protect, and, she suspected, the people it had failed most often. She had no idea that the folder in front of her marked, in her own handwriting, draft, federal guidelines on de-escalation and bias-based policing, review copy 3, was about to become the single most relevant document in the room. Grant Holloway was 51 years old, white, with close-cropped gray hair and pale, weathered skin that had spent 2 decades under Carolina's summer sun. He had 22 years on the force and a reputation, inside the department, for closing cases fast. What nobody outside the department knew, what would come out later, piece by piece, in a review that would take 4 months and consume the careers of 3 men, was that Grant had also accumulated 14 internal complaints over those 22 years, 11 of them involving black citizens, and that every single one of those 14 files had been quietly closed by the same man, his direct supervisor, Chief Roy Pemberton, a man who valued Grant's arrest numbers more than he valued the complaints stacking up in a drawer marked, without irony, pending review. At 12:38 that afternoon, a 19-year-old barista named Priya Anand had leaned toward Grant near the register and murmured something about a woman who'd walked out an hour earlier, without paying for a pastry, a woman Priya herself would later admit, under oath, she had only glimpsed from behind, wearing a coat that might have been navy or might have been black at a distance of maybe 30 feet. Priya had not said it was the woman in the corner. Priya had said, uncertainly, maybe her? I don't know. Honestly, it happened fast. Grant Holloway did not ask a second question. He crossed the cafe floor in 9 long strides, and by the time he reached Amara's table, in his mind, the case was already closed. Ma'am, I need you to stand up, he said, pitched loud, performing for the room the way men like Grant had performed for rooms their entire careers. Amara set her pen down parallel to the folder's edge, the same small, deliberate motion, the way her father had once set his pen down in that kitchen, and looked up at him. Why, she said, not a question mark in her voice. A statement shaped like a question. Ma'am, officer, she said, cutting across him, with a calm that landed harder than a shout would have. You are going to tell me what I am being accused of before I move a single muscle. That's not a request. That's the law. Something tightened in Grant's jaw. Behind him, Officer Wes Cotter, 34 years old, 6 years on the force, a man who had learned everything he knew about how to be a cop by watching Grant Holloway do it, shifted his weight and let his hand drift toward his belt, close enough to his taser, that 3 separate customers would later describe the gesture in their statements the exact same way, like he wanted us to see it. Wes Cotter was 34, also white, with a heavy build and a sunburned neck that never quite faded, a man who had learned everything he knew about how to be a cop by watching Grant Holloway do it. A third officer stood a few feet back, near the pastry case, saying nothing. His name was Theo Marsh, 26, white as well, thin and still slightly boyish in the face in a way that made the uniform look borrowed rather than earned. He was 26, for years into the job, and something in his stomach had gone cold and tight the moment Grant crossed the room, though he could not yet have told you why. He noticed, the way you notice a splinter before you feel it, that the woman in the corner had not once looked away from Grant's face, not down, not sideways, not toward the door. He noticed that her hands, folded on the table, were completely still. You match the description of a customer involved in a dispute this morning, Grant said. What description? Amara said. Grant did not answer. Instead, he reached across the table and closed his hand around the strap of her satchel. And that was the moment the entire cafe went quiet, the low hum of conversation cutting off mid-sentence at 4 different tables, a spoon freezing halfway to a mouth 2 seats over, the espresso machine finishing its hiss, into a silence that suddenly had weight to it. That was the first frozen moment. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound left in the Gilded Cup Cafe was the tick of the wall clock behind the register, and later, when investigators pulled the cafe's security footage, they would count exactly 6 seconds of that silence before Amara spoke again. "You do not have my consent to search that bag," she said, "and you have still not told me what crime you believe I've committed." "Refusing a lawful order is the crime you're committing right now," Grant said, and something in the way he said it, practiced, worn smooth from repetition, told Theo Marsh, standing by the pastry case, with his stomach in a knot, that his training officer had said this exact sentence to other people, in other rooms, more times than either of them would ever be able to count. Wes Cotter stepped forward, closing the gap, and rested his hand flat against the edge of Amara's table hard enough that her coffee cup rattled against its saucer. "Get up," he said. "Last time we asked nice." Amara looked at the coffee cup, still trembling faintly against the saucer, and then back up at Wes Cotter's face. And here was the thing that would come up again and again in witness statements. Over the following weeks, nobody in that cafe could remember Amara Whitfield ever once raising her voice. Not during what happened next. Not during any of it. The angrier the two officers became, the quieter and more still she seemed to grow, until the contrast between them felt, to everyone watching, like something close to unbearable. "I'm going to stand up," she said, "because I have nothing to hide, and no interest in escalating a situation you've already decided the outcome of. But I want every person in this room to hear me say clearly, I have committed no crime. I have been given no lawful reason for this detainment, and I am complying under protest." She rose from the chair slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer with one hand, and reached for the folder on the table, the one marked Draft, Federal Guidelines on De-Escalation, only for Grant to snatch it away from her before her fingers closed around it, flipping it open with a rough motion that scattered 2 loose pages onto the floor. "What's this?" he said, scanning the header, not really reading it, already looking for something more interesting. "Paperwork," Amara said. "You have no authority to search that either." He tossed the folder back onto the table, without apologizing, and one of the loose pages drifted under an adjacent chair, where a woman in her 60s, a retired schoolteacher named Dolores Feeney, sitting alone with a crossword puzzle she had stopped filling in 6 minutes earlier, watched it land, and did not move to pick it up because some old, cold part of her remembered exactly what happened to people who involved themselves in other people's business with a badge in the room. She would think about that unpicked up piece of paper for months afterward. At the next table over, a young man named Caleb Rourke, 22, a barista at a different cafe on his lunch break, wearing a faded green windbreaker, had already pulled out his phone and started recording, holding it low against his chest so it wouldn't be obvious. "Put that away," Grant snapped at him, without turning his whole body, the way a man snaps at a dog he expects to obey on reflex. Caleb did not put it away. Wes Cotter reached for Amara's wrist. She did not pull back. She simply turned her head toward him and asked, in the same level voice she had used for everything else, "Before you put those on me, I want your name and badge number," spoken clearly enough for this room to hear it. Wes hesitated, half a second, no more, and something about that hesitation, the tiny crack in his certainty, was the first sign, though nobody in that cafe could have named it yet, that the ground under this entire encounter had begun, almost imperceptibly, to shift. "Officer Wes Cotter," he said finally, badge number rattled off fast, like tearing off a bandage. Grant gave his own name and number with something closer to relish, enjoying the sound of it, the way it seemed to reassert control over a room that had gone strangely still around him. Theo Marsh, when it came to him, said his name, so quietly that Amara had to ask him to repeat it, and when he did, his voice cracked slightly in the middle of his own badge number, and for 1/2 second his eyes met hers, and something passed between them that had no name yet either. She repeated all 3 names silently to herself, twice, the way her father had once taught her to memorize a witness's testimony verbatim, before it could be altered in the retelling. Grant Holloway, Wes Cotter, Theo Marsh, 12:44 p.m. On your knees, Wes Cotter said next, and the words landed in the cafe harder than anything that had come before them. A woman at the counter gasped audibly. Amara did not move. "There is no lawful basis for that instruction," she said, "and both of you know it." "Knees," Wes said again, and this time his hand closed around her shoulder and pressed downward. And for one terrible second the whole cafe watched a woman in a charcoal blazer forced toward the floor of a public cafe in front of 22 strangers over a pastry that had cost $4.30. Grant said nothing to stop it. He watched, arms crossed, the way a man watches a demonstration he has personally approved of. It was Theo Marsh who finally spoke. "Wes, that's enough. She's complying. She hasn't done anything I told her to do." Wes snapped back. "She stood up when he told her to," Theo said, nodding toward Grant, his voice not loud, but not shaking either. The first time all afternoon he had said anything at all in front of his two senior partners. "You don't need her on the floor to write a report." Wes hesitated, the second small crack of the day, and let his hand fall away. Amara straightened slowly, without a word of thanks to Theo, without acknowledging the moment at all, because some part of her understood, even then, that thanking him for the bare minimum of decency in that room would have cost her something she was not willing to give up in front of Grant Holloway. The cuffs closed around her wrists a moment later, too tight. Tight enough that a faint red line would still be visible on her skin 4 hours afterward, when a doctor at the federal building photographed it for the record. The metallic click of the ratchet mechanism was, for one full second, the loudest sound in the room. That was the second frozen moment. 22 people in that cafe, customers, 2 baristas, the owner standing rigid behind the counter, with a rag forgotten in her hand, and not one of them said a single word. The light through the front windows fell in long yellow bars across the floor, catching the dust in the air, and for that 1 second everything in the Gilded Cup Cafe seemed to hold perfectly still, as if the whole room understood, before any of them could have explained why, that something was happening, that they would still be talking about a year later. The cafe's owner, a white woman in her 50s named Lena Ashford, stood frozen behind the counter, with her rag still hanging from one hand, and she would tell Amara, months later, in this same cafe, that she had wanted more than anything in that moment to say something, to ask, at minimum, what this woman was even accused of doing, and that the reason she had not was so simple it embarrassed her. She was afraid that if she spoke up, Grant Holloway would decide her cafe was somewhere he no longer needed to be careful. She had heard, secondhand, what had happened to another business owner 3 blocks over who had once questioned an officer's conduct and spent the following 8 months getting his fire code inspected 4 separate times. As Grant walked Amara toward the door, his hand closing around her upper arm, with more force than the moment required, she glanced once at the small black dome of the security camera mounted above the register, and the expression on her face was not fear. It was the calm, terrible patience of a woman who had spent her entire career learning exactly how long the truth takes to travel, and who had already decided she was willing to wait for it. At the 4th District station on Kings Drive, Grant sat down at his desk at 1:07 p.m. and began composing the arrest report with the easy, practiced rhythm of a man who had typed 100 reports just like it. Uncooperative, confrontational, resisted verbal compliance, disruptive to the peace of the establishment. The words came fast, and none of them were true, and he did not hesitate over a single one of them. Wes Cotter signed beneath his name, without reading the second paragraph twice, his mind already halfway out the door toward the end of his shift, and a 6-pack waiting in his refrigerator. Theo Marsh read it 3 times. He read the word confrontational, and thought about the woman's completely still hands folded on the table. He read the word resisted, and thought about how she had stood up on her own the moment she decided to, smoothing her blazer with one unhurried hand. He set the pen down, without signing it, and said, quietly, "I don't think this is what happened." Grant did not look up from his own paperwork. "Sign it, Marsh. I want to change the wording on the section about sign it," Grant said again. And this time there was something underneath the words that Theo understood, without needing it explained. A threat shaped like patience, the kind senior officers had been using on rookies, since long before either of them had been born. Theo signed it. He hated himself for it in a way he would carry around in his chest for the next 4 months like a stone he couldn't put down. In interview room 2, Amara sat with her hands cuffed in front of her now. Someone, at least, had had the sense to move them. From behind her back, her spine straight, her expression composed despite the faint red pressure lines still visible on her wrists. She did not ask for a phone call. She did not cry. She simply waited, the way a person waits, when they already know exactly how a situation is going to end, and are only curious how long it will take everyone else in the room to catch up. Grant entered at 1:52 p.m., a folder tucked under one arm, still fully convinced he controlled every variable in the room. Name, he said. Amara Whitfield. Occupation. She paused, and in that pause was 23 years of a silver pen sitting on a kitchen table, 23 years of a father's zip-tied wrists in a courthouse hallway, 23 years of learning exactly when silence was worth more than an argument. Attorney, she said. Grant laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. Of course you are. He said it the way a man says something he has said 100 times before, to 100 different people sitting in that same chair, each of them claiming some title that turned out, in his experience, to mean nothing at all. Who for, he said. The federal government. Sure you are. He leaned back, enjoying himself. Everybody who sits in that chair's got a story. Amara did not argue the point. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and asked, almost conversationally, "Do you know what time it is right now, Officer Holloway?" He glanced, irritated, at the clock mounted on the wall, 1:54. She nodded once. Good, because at 2 o'clock, this entire department is going to have a very different kind of problem than the one you currently think you're dealing with. Grant laughed again, louder this time, certain this was nothing more than the last, desperate move of a woman who had run out of better ones. He had heard threats like it before. I know the mayor, my brother's a lawyer, you'll regret this, and every single one of them had turned out to be exactly nothing. He had no way of knowing that Amara Whitfield had never once, in 22 years of practicing law, made a claim in a room like this one that she could not immediately back with documentation. At 1:58 p.m., in a wood-paneled office 280 miles north in Washington, D.C., Amara's chief of staff, a sharp, unflappable woman named Farah Nasser, glanced at her phone and saw a missed check in alert flash red across her screen. Amara had a standing rule. If she went more than 90 minutes without a location ping during an unannounced outing, Farah was to call the local field office immediately. It was 1:58. The last ping had come in at 12:23. Farah made 2 phone calls. The first was to the FBI's Charlotte field office. The second, for minutes later, once the first call had confirmed a name and a booking number, was to the front desk of the 4th District Station on Kings Drive. The phone on Chief Roy Pemberton's desk began to ring at exactly 2 o'clock p.m. He answered it, without urgency, expecting a scheduling call, and the voice on the other end identified itself as calling from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, requesting a private line and confirmation of a booking that had come through the district's system 14 minutes earlier under the name Whitfield, Amara. Chief Pemberton felt the floor of his understanding tilt, slowly at first, and then all at once, the way ice gives beneath weight it was never built to hold. Within 90 seconds, he learned that the woman sitting handcuffed in interview room 2 had been sworn into office as the Attorney General of the United States exactly 6 days earlier, and that she had been conducting an unannounced, unofficial visit intended, in part, to observe firsthand how ordinary people were treated during routine encounters with local police, a visit that had, in the space of 83 minutes, produced exactly the kind of evidence she had not expected and had not wanted to find. The chief hung up the phone and sat frozen at his desk for 11 full seconds, long enough that his assistant, passing by his open door, would later remember thinking something had happened to him medically. Then he stood and moved down the hallway toward interview room 2 faster than he had moved in years, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with fitness and everything to do with fear. He found Grant Holloway standing just outside the door, still fully convinced the situation was contained. "Who's in there?" Chief Pemberton demanded. Grant shrugged. Some woman causing trouble at a cafe. Her name? Whitfield. Amara Whitfield. Why? Do you have any idea? The chief said, and his voice had gone very quiet, quieter than anyone in that hallway had ever heard him speak. Who Amara Whitfield is? For the first time, since he had crossed the cafe floor 2 hours earlier, something like doubt crept into Grant Holloway's face, though even now, even in that hallway, some stubborn part of him was still not ready to believe it. Theo Marsh, standing a few feet away, pulled his phone from his pocket with hands that were not entirely steady and typed the name into a search bar. The headline appeared in under 2 seconds, bold and unmistakable. Whitfield sworn in, AS 90th Attorney General of the United States. Theo stared at his own screen for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes. Grant's face drained of color in a way that would, months later, when the internal affairs footage was reviewed frame by frame, become the single most replayed 6 seconds of the entire investigation. The exact moment a man watched 22 years of certainty collapse in real time. Wes Cotter took an unconscious step backward, as if putting distance between himself and a fire that had just discovered it could burn hotter than he'd planned for. The chief's hands trembled slightly as he ordered the handcuffs removed immediately. Grant walked back into interview room 4 minutes later, his voice unrecognizable from the one he'd used 90 minutes earlier. Ms. Whitfield, he began. She lifted her eyes to his, without a single trace of triumph. Attorney General Whitfield, she corrected, quietly, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees. What happened over the next 6 hours would later be described in an internal memo that leaked to 3 separate news outlets within a week as the most surgical response any of us had ever witnessed from a person who had every right, in that moment, to lose control completely. Amara did not demand the immediate termination of the 3 officers. She did not raise her voice a single time. Instead, sitting at a table in the chief's own office, with her wrists still faintly red, she asked for one thing. Bring me the arrest report. When it arrived, she read every line, without comment, without a flicker of anger crossing her face, though Theo Marsh, standing near the door, unable to make himself leave, watched her jaw tighten by perhaps a millimeter at the word confrontational, and understood, with a chill, that she had noticed the lie the way a surgeon notices a millimeter of misalignment nobody else in the room would ever catch. Where is the body camera footage from the arrest? She asked. Silence. The cafe's security footage. Silence. The original dispatch call that sent 3 officers into that cafe. Chief Pemberton, visibly shaking now, offered to have the recording pulled and delivered to her personally, as a courtesy, the way a man offers a small kindness hoping it will soften something enormous that is coming. Amara looked at him steadily. I don't want a favor, Chief Pemberton. I want evidence. Complete. Unaltered. Every complaint filed against these 3 officers and against this department, going back as far as your records reach. The chief's stomach folded in on itself because he understood, faster than either Grant or Wes did, exactly what she was asking for and exactly what it would find. I am not interested, Amara said, and for the first time, that afternoon there was something in her voice that was not quite anger, but was close enough to it that the temperature of the room changed again, in punishing 3 officers because they humiliated me personally. I am interested in finding out how many other people this has already happened to, people who didn't have a title or a badge of their own or a phone call from Washington to save them. Grant Holloway, standing near the wall, with his arms crossed, chose that moment to speak for the first time since walking back into that room. With respect, ma'am, Attorney General, I was following a legitimate report. I had a description. I acted on the information available to me at the time. I don't think you had a 19-year-old employee's uncertain glimpse of a woman from 30 feet away, Amara said, cutting across him, without raising her voice even a fraction, and you turned it into a certainty within 4 seconds, because some part of you had already decided what kind of woman deserved the benefit of the doubt in that cafe and what kind did not. You didn't act on information, Officer Holloway. You acted on an assumption you'd made 100 times before and never once had to answer for. Grant's jaw tightened. That's not. You laughed, she said, when I asked if you knew who I was. Twice. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not because I think being the Attorney General should have changed how you treated me. Because it shouldn't have needed to. For the first time, Grant had nothing left to say. Wes Cotter, standing beside him, stared at the floor. Theo Marsh, still by the door, felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight since 12:41 that afternoon. Not relief, exactly, but something closer to the first breath after holding one too long. The investigation that followed consumed for months. Federal investigators, working alongside an independent review board Amara appointed, within her first week back in Washington, pulled 14 years of complaint files against Grant Holloway, complaints that had been quietly closed, one after another, by Chief Pemberton himself, who had valued Grant's arrest numbers over the 11 black citizens who had, over more than a decade, tried and failed to have their voices taken seriously. 3 of those citizens agreed to speak to investigators on the record. One of them, a retired mechanic named Otis Bell, who had been detained outside his own repair shop in 2019 on almost identical grounds, a vague description, an assumption, a refusal to ask a single clarifying question, sat across from Amara personally in a conference room in October and said quietly, I didn't think anybody was ever going to look at that file again. I looked at it, Amara told him. Every page. Grant Holloway was formally charged in November with falsification of official records and repeated abuse of authority, charges built not only on Amara's case, but on a pattern investigators had traced across 2 decades. He did not, at any point during the proceedings, admit that the report he wrote about Amara that April afternoon had been false. In his final deposition, 3 weeks before his trial, he still maintained that his actions had been consistent with departmental training and procedure at the time, a sentence that would become, among the investigators who worked the case, a kind of dark shorthand for a man who could not, even facing the total collapse of everything he had built, bring himself to say the 2 words that might have changed how the public remembered him. I'm sorry. He was convicted on 2 counts the following spring and stripped of his pension. Wes Cotter was charged as an accessory for co-signing a report he had not read, a fact that would follow him through 2 failed attempts to find work in law enforcement anywhere in the state of North Carolina afterward. Unlike Grant, he did eventually say the words in a hallway outside the courtroom to a reporter who happened to be standing nearby. I signed it because it was easier than asking questions. I think about that every day now, and Amara, reading the quote in a briefing packet weeks later, allowed herself one small, private thought, that honesty arriving late was still worth something, even if it could never be worth enough. Theo Marsh cooperated fully from the very first interview, providing testimony that established the pattern investigators needed to move beyond Amara's single case into the department's 14-year history. It cost him nearly every friendship he had built inside the department. 2 former colleagues stopped speaking to him entirely, and a third left a single word, traitor, taped to his locker, that nobody ever claimed responsibility for. But 11 months later, when the department's newly restructured Office of Civilian Oversight opened its doors, its first hire, recommended personally by Amara Whitfield's office, was a 27-year-old former patrol officer named Theo Marsh, who took the job because, as he told a local reporter, I want to be the person in the room who asks the second question. I wasn't that day. I'm going to be from now on. Chief Roy Pemberton resigned in December, 3 days before the city council could formally vote on his removal, issuing a 2-sentence statement that offered no real explanation and asked, in its final line, for privacy, a courtesy he had rarely extended over 18 years as chief to the people whose complaints he had spent a decade quietly filing away. Amara made certain his resignation did not close the matter. She insisted the position remain vacant until a new, independent oversight structure was fully built and operational, so that whoever eventually took the chief's chair would inherit a department already accountable to something larger than one office and one man's judgment. Caleb Rourke, the young man, who had refused to lower his phone that afternoon, later handed his footage over to investigators voluntarily, unprompted, walking into the 4th District Station on his own 2 days after the story broke nationally, and asking to speak to whoever was running the review. His 41 seconds of video, shaky, slightly out of focus, but unmistakable, became one of the 2 pieces of evidence, alongside the cafe's own security recording, that made every subsequent denial from Grant Holloway impossible to sustain in front of a jury. When a reporter later asked Caleb why he hadn't simply walked away like everyone else in that cafe, he shrugged and said, "Somebody has to be the person who doesn't look down at their shoes." I figured it might as well be me that day. Dolores Feeney, the retired schoolteacher who had watched a page of Amara's own policy memo drift under a stranger's chair and left it there, wrote Amara a handwritten letter that arrived at the Justice Department in July. It was 4 sentences long. The 3rd sentence read, "I have spent 31 years teaching children that courage is supposed to feel brave in the moment, and I am sorry to tell you that it mostly just feels like fear that arrives too late to matter." Amara kept the letter in the same folder as her father's old case files, because she understood, better than almost anyone, exactly what Dolores meant. Priya Anand, the 19-year-old barista, whose uncertain, 30-foot glimpse had started the entire afternoon, was never formally disciplined. Investigators found no evidence she had acted with any intent beyond an honest, badly mistaken guess. But she left her job at the Gilded Cup within the month regardless, unable to walk past that corner table during her shifts without her hands beginning to shake. She wrote to Amara too, eventually an email forwarded through the department's public comment line, asking only one question: "How do I make sure I never do that again?" Amara's office sent back a single line in response, drafted personally. "Ask the second question before you decide you already know the first answer." It is usually the only thing standing between an honest mistake and a tragedy. 6 months after, that April afternoon, on a quiet Tuesday, with no press and no security detail trailing behind her, Amara Whitfield walked back into the Gilded Cup Cafe on Trade Street. Lena Ashford recognized her the instant she stepped through the door, and her first words were an apology, offered without hesitation or excuse. "I keep thinking about that day," Lena said, "about how long I stood there behind that counter and didn't say a single word." "You weren't the one they put handcuffs on," Amara said gently. "No," Lena agreed. "I was the one who watched it happen and stayed quiet because I was scared of what it would cost me to speak. I've had a long time to sit with that. It doesn't feel any better with distance." Amara looked around the cafe slowly, the same window, the same corner table, the same bars of afternoon light falling across the floor, and something in her expression softened. "Sometimes," she said, "watching closely and remembering what you saw is exactly where courage starts, even when it takes longer to show up than any of us would like." Lena poured her a cup of coffee, and this time Amara accepted it, without a moment's hesitation, settling into the chair at the same corner table where, 6 months earlier, a father's silver pen had rested parallel to a folder's edge just before everything changed. She set the same pen down on the table now, in the same place, out of a habit that had outlived the moment it was born from, and while the 2 women simply sat together, saying very little, the way people sit together after something has mattered to both of them in entirely different ways. "I almost didn't come back here," Amara admitted, glancing once toward the spot near the door where the cuffs had closed around her wrists. "Why did you?" "Because I didn't want my last memory of this room to be built entirely out of fear," Amara said. "Not when so much has happened here since." A month later, standing at a podium in Washington to announce a sweeping set of federal reforms, mandatory body cameras across every department receiving federal funding, tamper-proof digital record systems, independent civilian review boards, protected channels for citizens to file complaints without fear of retaliation, formal legal protections for officers who report misconduct within their own ranks, and mandatory bias and de-escalation training renewed every 18 months, a reporter in the third row raised her hand and asked the question that had been circling the entire story for months. "Attorney General Whitfield, Do you believe those 3 officers would have treated you differently if they'd known who you were from the very beginning? Amara considered the question for a long moment, unwilling to offer it anything less than the honesty it deserved. Yes, she said. Doesn't that suggest, the reporter pressed, that the real problem here was simply that they didn't know? Amara looked directly into the camera, her voice as steady and unhurried as it had been from the very first second inside that cafe. No, she said. The real problem is that they should never have needed to know who I was in order to treat me with basic dignity under a law that is supposed to protect every single person equally. Justice cannot depend on whether the person standing in front of an officer happens to hold a title someone recognizes. It has to exist the same way for everyone, in every cafe, on every street corner, in every interview room in this country. If it only shows up once a name gets attached to enough power to demand it, then it was never really justice in the first place. It was just fear wearing justice's clothes. She stepped away from the podium without ceremony, without a single note of triumph in the way she walked, because she had never wanted a victory lap. Only, from the very beginning, the truth, traveling exactly as far and as fast as it deserved to. An aide met her partway down the corridor and handed her a fresh folder, a new case waiting for her attention before the day was finished. Amara opened it without breaking stride, scanned the first page for a few seconds, and closed it again, tucking it beneath her arm with the same steady, unhurried composure she had carried through every moment of the past 6 months, the same composure her father had carried through a courthouse hallway 23 years earlier, the same pen resting now in the inside pocket of her blazer, close to her heart, exactly where it had always belonged. "Let's get to work," she said quietly, to no one, and to everyone walking beside her, and she moved forward into the long corridor, and the next case waiting at the end of it, carrying with her the same quiet, unshakable resolve that had defined every moment, since 3 officers underestimated exactly who they were dealing with, and learned, far too late, exactly how much that single afternoon would eventually cost them. If this story stayed with you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognize someone in it, maybe even yourself, take a moment to like it, so it reaches someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with anyone who's ever been made to feel small in a room that should have treated them fairly. And tell me in the comments, have you ever stood in a room like that one? And if you have, which side of it were you standing on? I read every single answer.